You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hey everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for January 18th, 2019. This week, physician burnout, aspiration thrombectomy, eating fish for cardiac health, health insurance and outcomes, and febuxostat. First topic is burnout. The thing about medicine is that when you are sick, you depend on another human being. Ideally, you want your nurse, doctor, surgeon, APC to be healthy of body and mind. And the latter is important because good medical care requires patience and empathy. When I had an injured thumb, I stopped operating until it healed. When I had influenza, I stayed home until I was better. These are physical ailments that impair our abilities. A recent Medscape survey chronicles the growing problem of mental illness among caregivers. Now sit down for this. 44% of physicians met the criteria for burnout. That's up 2% from last year. And this one struck me too. 14% of the 15,000 respondents report having had thoughts about suicide. Women had higher burnout rates than men, 50% versus 39%. And as for cause, a little less than 2/3 of the docs cite excessive administrative tasks. Now, my comments on this, or my take on this, is that burnout mostly stems from a loss of meaning. Medicine is hard and it's always been hard, but in the past, there seemed like there was more meaning in the taking care of people. The recent trends towards making medical care a commodity has been toxic. I've talked to a bunch of my colleagues about this, and I can't speak for academic settings, but here in private practice, burnout surely accelerated with the employed model of care. We thought employment would be great. The employer would take care of the business of medicine, pay the employees, deal with payers, and we could be freed up to care for their patients. This was a fantasy. Instead, we went from being doctors to providers. Now that's a term that implies something transactional rather than care based in humanity. Very soon after signing on to be employees, we began being treated as employees. This means producing. In today's currency, it is the relative value unit, or RVU. As providers, hospitals need us to generate units, see lots of patients, order scans, do procedures. Conservative thinking, careful clinicians are valued much less. Work and research, not important. Outside work and community outreach, not important. Writing or critical appraisal, not important. As employees, we do corporate training modules, keep track of vacation time, just like all other hourly employees. And another thing, we are now encouraged and sometimes forced to attend burnout prevention sessions, which actually worsen the toxic employee culture, especially when non-clinicians lecture us about being happy. Look, I hope the culture of medicine changes. Maybe it will. The influx of women clinicians is a hopeful sign. And society has surely made progress in other areas such as racism, sexism, and bad behavior is no longer tolerated. Now, if I had control of the ship and I had one piece of advice for new doctors coming out, it is to join together. The happiest doctors in our community are those who remained in big independent groups. But listen, for the record, I would still go to medical school and I would still be an electrophysiologist. I love being an EP doctor. Next topic, aspiration thrombectomy. Now, the cause of most acute MI is clot. Thus, it makes perfect sense when opening an acutely occluded coronary artery, you would suck the clot out rather than squish it and push it downstream to cause more trouble. Except not one, but 2 RCTs showed that aspiration thrombectomy was no benefit, and actually there was a trend toward harm. Dr. Robert Ye and many co-authors who are interested in whether doctors actually changed their practice and incorporated this evidence. They did a cohort study of almost 700,000 PCI interventions. This was culled from the NCDR PCI database. And they found that sucking clot out of the coronary artery increased from 2009 to 2011, but then declined gradually and steadily through 2016. Their observational analysis also included a sub-study of 3-month outcomes taken from CMS data. And they found that selective aspiration thrombectomy use was associated with a small excess risk of in-hospital stroke and no difference in other outcomes through 3 months of follow-up, which is very similar to what the randomized controlled trials showed. Now, on the one hand, you could say that this was good news. Aspiration thrombectomy use declined with the publication of the RCTs. But on the other hand, there was still tons of variability of its use, and it's still used by a not insignificant number of operators. For instance, the median aspiration thrombectomy use was 3.5%, and only 1/3 of operators did not use it at all. This is a tough topic here, right? Because 2 RCTs failed to show a benefit, and 1 found it associated with the higher rates of stroke. This observational study also found an association with stroke. Now, could there be selected patients that benefit from aspiration thrombectomy? Maybe. But with no signal of benefit from 2 trials and the possibility of higher rates of stroke, I think the onus of proof is on the proponents to find a group of patients that benefit. I totally agree with the study PI Dr. Semasewski's comment regarding the preconceived notions and set practices of cardiologists. These are strong. Indeed, the de-adoption of visually appealing but non-beneficial therapies is quite hard. Next topic, marine omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, you remember the shock of the Reduce It trial. Remember, high-dose icosapent ethyl, or pure EPA fish oil, reduced major adverse cardiac events by a whopping 4.8% in absolute terms. This was a shocking finding because numerous trials of fish oil had failed to show benefits. One of the reasons proposed as to why icosapent ethyl worked and other omega-3 formulations did not was its purity. It was pure EPA. Publishing in Stroke, Danish researchers have lent support to the idea that pure EPA might have made the difference in Reduce It. They performed an observational study using 57,000 participants in the Diet, Cancer, and Health cohort, and then linked outcomes there with the Danish National Registry. And as observational studies go, this was a particularly strong one, as the authors did not just rely on food frequency questionnaires. Rather, patients in this study had adipose tissue biopsies, which allowed measuring fatty acid composition in a sub-cohort of more than 3,000 patients. Also adding strength was the large number of ischemic stroke events, almost 1,900. So the findings were that adipose tissue content of EPA was inversely associated with total ischemic strokes, and a hazard ratio of 0.74, and it was statistically significant. The EPA content in adipose tissue was also inversely associated with small vessel occlusion, and lower rates of large artery atherosclerosis also associated with higher adipose tissue content of EPA. And on dietary questioning, lower rates of large artery atherosclerosis were seen with higher intakes of total marine polyunsaturated fatty acids, EPA, and DHA. Now, an interesting sub-finding was that cardioembolism associated with higher intake of total marine omega-3s, as well as with higher adipose tissue content of total marine polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, the data on embolism have to be interpreted cautiously because the number of strokes labeled as embolic were 100, while total strokes here were 1,900, so smaller numbers. Okay, friends, all the caveats of observational studies apply, mainly confounding. For example, those who eat a high EPA intake and have high EPA in their adipose tissue probably have other factors that may have led to reduced stroke. But these findings do nothing at all to weaken the strong results of Reduce It, and they certainly support the benefits of fish intake. Next topic is Medicaid expansion and outcomes. Now, one of the problems I had with the Affordable Care Act when it was passed was that it was mostly insurance reform, not healthcare reform. Having health insurance, consuming more health care, I predicted would not lead to better outcomes. In fact, if I ever had another blog, the leading title would be How Healthcare Fails to Deliver Health. A large observational study from Harvard and WashU researchers support this thesis, and in doing so also support the famous Rand and Oregon health studies. First, the big observational study that was published in JAMA Cardiology. The researchers' question was, did rates of uninsurance, quality of care, and outcomes among patients with acute MI change after states elected to expand Medicaid compared with non-expansion states? So this was another NCDR database study looking at adults under the age of 65 who were admitted for acute MI between the years 2012 and 2017. And the before and after exposure in this observational study was Medicaid expansion in 2014. So Medicaid expansion was associated with a significant reduction in rates of uninsurance among patients who had MI. But get this, the quality of care and the outcomes did not improve among low-income adults in expansion compared with non-expansion states. Specifically, improvement in in-hospital mortality was similar between expansion and non-expansion states. So my comments here is I think you have to interpret these findings in the context of the RAND study, in which people were randomized to varying degrees of free health care. And in RAND, those who had free care consumed more health care, but they did not enjoy better health. Similarly, in the Oregon Health Study in 2008, the state of Oregon held the lottery to decide who was eligible to enroll in Medicaid. This gave researchers the opportunity to compare the health outcomes of lottery winners and losers. And again, people who won the lottery received more care, but in most objective measures of physiological health, there was no significant difference. Now, of course, if you believe healthcare delivers health, you could say that this study, that MI outcomes in the hospital are not that sensitive to having health coverage because the very ill get decent care regardless of their insurance status. Perhaps that is true, but I'm working on a column now that addresses the hidden motives of healthcare, and that much of what we accept and deem good care is actually related more to hidden motives in our brains related to signaling that we actually care. Be sure, I'm not against expanding health coverage. In fact, I believe if we made healthcare more about outcomes and less about a show of conspicuous caring, we could easily afford healthcare for all. Final topic today is about the gout drug febuxostat. It's a non-purine inhibitor of xanthine oxidase that is used for the management of hyperuricemia in patients with gout as it decreases the formation of uric acid. This week, FDA reviewers voted by a large margin to still recommend febuxostat for some patients with gout-related hyperuricemia after a discussion of a post-marketing study showing possible cardiovascular risk. This is a notable recommendation because the trial they're talking about, called CARES, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, found that in patients with gout and high cardiac risk, febuxostat was, yes, non-inferior to allopurinol with respect to rates of adverse cardiovascular events, but all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality were statistically higher with febuxostat than with allopurinol. The CARES trial had about 3,100 patients per arm in either febuxostat or allopurinol. It was a non-inferiority trial, and 10.8% of patients on febuxostat had a primary endpoint versus 10.4% on allopurinol. The non-inferiority margin was set at 1.3, and the upper bound in the trial was 1.23, so it did meet non-inferiority. However, the problem came in the 1.1% higher rate of CV death and a 1.4% higher rate of overall death with febuxostat. This is hard to explain on mechanisms, but it doesn't really matter what the mechanisms are. CARES was a cardiovascular safety trial that barely met non-inferiority and had statistically significantly higher rates of death in the febuxostat arm. What's more, in this trial, about 45% of the patients either stopped taking the drug or were lost to follow-up. And remember, in a non-inferiority trial, Patients who stop the therapy biases towards the null. I don't agree with the FDA. The FDA is supposed to protect us. They say you can use this drug in selected patients, but you should discuss the risks with the patients. And this whole discussion business is nuts, right? 99+% of my patients don't want to know what the hazard ratio was for the chance of harm. They want to know in a very binary, dichotomous way, doctor, is this drug safe to take? So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I am grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, if you like this podcast, please consider subscribing, giving us a rating, or writing a comment, and that way other people can find it. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.